Investigation is a dark heart in the iron hand of justice.
It's a bizarre match, a match made in hell.
They seemed like the perfect young couple, falling in love, planning their future. The only problem...
There's this dead body being uncovered in a lake at that very moment.
See how they carry out a twisted scheme to drug and kill young girls, even her little sister, and hear her tell in her own words why it all happened.
And now that I look back, I think it was stupid. I mean, I should have gone to the police from day one. But my mind was so messed up.
How did a young girl marry a man she suspected was a rapist? And how did they live out a sadistic fantasy, getting away with killing after killing? Theirs is a love story that redefines the vows between husband and wife. On this dark heart, iron hand, to love and to kill. By all accounts, the young couple you're about to meet lived a double life as the loving newlyweds who visited family on the holidays and the twisted pair who kept slaves and then killed them. Were they equal partners in crime, or was she just another of his victims? How did they get away with it for so long while police had critical evidence right in their hands? The outcome of this case has enraged so many and may soon come back to haunt us all.
It was certainly played up that they were the perfect couple, the Ken and Barbie. Much of that changed, of course, as soon as you found out that they were the homicidal maniacs that they were.
Disbelief that evil did not dress in a trench coat and sit on a park bench any longer. You cannot recognize it. The facade, the way they presented, no one would have a chance.
Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka may look like a typical attractive couple, but behind those ocean blue eyes and blonde hair, they turn out to be anything but. October 17, 1987, fate brings Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo together. It's a match that is decidedly not made in heaven.
Karla Homolka was in Toronto to attend a convention involving pet stores and is staying at a hotel with a friend. And she goes in for a very late snack in the restaurant. And lo and behold, Paul happens to walk by the window or the door and spots this young girl. Before they know it, the two of them are sitting together. They're having a drink, they're having a meal, whatever. And they're ending up in bed together that very same night.
Their date turns out to be more than a one-night stand.
Well, you know, if it's a bizarre match, a match made in hell, you know, because Karla is the only, I mean, this is well documented. Karla was the only woman Paul Bernardo had ever met who had her own set of real handcuffs.
When he meets 17-year-old Karla, 23-year-old Paul Bernardo is a month away from graduating from the University of Toronto and is already working for the accounting firm Price Waterhouse.
He was quite a popular guy, you know, and he was, you know, sort of aggressive heterosexual.
Karla Homolka is the eldest of 3 daughters in her family. She works as a veterinarian assistant at an animal clinic. To some, the match seems perfect. But what Karla may not have known at the beginning of their relationship is that Paul Bernardo is already leading a double life.
A series of rapes took place in the city of Scarborough.
Although Paul Bernardo declined our request for an interview for this broadcast, his attorney, Tony Bryant, agreed to speak with us.
The rapes were vicious. There was some restraint applied to these women. There was a lot of demeaning language visited upon them.
His attorney says Paul subsequently never challenged the fact that he was responsible for a number of the Scarborough rapes. But some believe he continued his attacks even after he became involved with Karla, and that she became well aware of his criminal behavior as their relationship blossomed.
In his case, I just think that she gave him some kind of magical permission to be the rapist that he truly wanted to become, and that's what he did.
Although Dr. Fred Berlin, a leading expert in sexual disorders, wasn't involved in the Bernardo Homolka case, he has studied the case file.
Well, there was clearly something peculiar to the combination of these two that allowed this to go on. I mean, there are many women, certainly, who, if they found out that the man they were involved with was a serial rapist, would not condone or put up with that.
The Toronto Metro Police Department investigated each and every one of the Scarborough rapes, but always came up empty. Although at one point they did have the perpetrator right under their nose.
I think that this print, this description was being put out in the media, and a bank teller or a bank manager or someone associated with this bank said, gee, that looks an awful lot like Paul Bernardo. And sure enough, the police went around and interviewed him, and he provided a sample.
A sample of DNA. But it is November of 1990, and DNA analysis is still in its earliest stages. Although the DNA sample will come back to haunt Paul, some believe an opportunity was missed that could have prevented the horror to come.
The Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto was not under attack, but was certainly swamped with requests by every police force in the province of Ontario to produce analyses of samples coming in on every case from one end of the province to the other. So it just sort of languished on sort of like the back shelf and never surfaced for the longest time.
By now, Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka are engaged to be married. But behind closed doors, Carla, the angelic-looking bride-to-be, is not as innocent as she appears.
She either got in the habit or was told to, take your pick, to write these little love notes that she would leave on his pillow, talking about what she might do to him when he got home and when they went to bed that night. And it was pretty obvious what was coming through. She liked him. She loved him. She was quite prepared to do all these things.
Not only is Carla prepared to satisfy Paul on her own, she is even prepared to risk the safety of her own flesh and blood to secure their relationship.
He was showing an interest in this young teenager, and it would happen to be her sister. So in Carla's view, the way to deal with this was to take control of the situation and set her sister up for his sexual gratification. And the idea was she would give her sister to him for Christmas.
But Carla and Paul's scheme for her sister, 15-year-old Tammy Homolka, does not go exactly as planned.
V8 presents
This is Christmas 1990. Everybody.
Christmas Eve, 1990. 26-year-old Paul Bernardo and 20-year-old Carla Homolka are now engaged and plan to marry in June. After 3 years together, Carla now understands Paul's sexual cravings, and by some accounts is already aware that she's in love with a serial rapist. With this in mind, she prepares to give Paul a gift, her 15-year-old virgin sister, Tammy.
She intended to give her sister to him as a Christmas present. And she planned to do that by taking halothane, which is an anesthetic from the veterinary clinic where she works, stealing it, and also stealing sleeping pills from the clinic.
Here, cuddle.
You are looking at actual home video taken by Paul Bernardo at the home of his future in-laws on that fateful Christmas Eve.
Are you in the Christmas cheer? That's all I want to know.
Yeah.
Tammy has a cocktail that Carla and Paul have laced with sleeping pills. After the rest of the family goes to sleep for the night, Carla and Paul wait for Tammy to pass out. And then, together, not only do they sexually molest and rape Tammy, but they videotape it. Paul Bernardo's attorney, Tony Bryant, eventually views the tapes.
The assault on Tammy was graphic, complete, ugly, horrific. Carla's clearly applying all the drugs to her sister's nostrils so that she would remain comatose while this was going on.
But soon, Carla and Paul's plan takes a fateful turn. Tammy Homolka stops breathing. Their amateur attempts to revive her fail.
Tammy died of a drug overdose and then being hit with anesthetic on a cloth.
The St. Catharines Police Department accepts the story that Tammy, while intoxicated, passed out and then choked on her own vomit.
It's Christmas time. There was certainly evidence of some drinking by Tammy Homolka that was even videotaped, and everybody said that she had become somewhat intoxicated. And the story that both Paul and Carla gave independently seemed to indicate that there was no foul play.
What was remarkable about her death was that it went unchallenged.
I think you'd have to say that because Carla was responsible for the administration of the drugs, that she was more likely to have been the killer because that was the cause of death. I mean, the sexual assault didn't kill Tammy Homolka. It was the application of an alibi.
Tammy is buried on December 27th, 1990, but comes back into the lives of Paul and Carla just days later in a grotesque game of make-believe.
There is explicit videotape between Carla and Paul, where Carla ends up dressing up as her sister, and they end up having sexual intercourse in Tammy Homolka's bedroom, where Carla is playing the role of her sister.
On January 28, 1991, Paul and Carla move into their own house at 57 Bayview Drive.
Carla decided her father wasn't paying enough attention to her and that he was overcome by grief, and the parents wanted to postpone the wedding, which was scheduled for June. She ostracized them and they moved out.
6 months later, 57 Bayview becomes the site of another horrific attack on a teenage acquaintance of Carla's, who later became known as Jane Doe.
So what Carla does in June is that she corrals a young teenage girl that hung around Carla at the pet shop, and then phoned Paul on his car phone and said, come on home, honey. I have a wedding present for you. And when he got there, he found this Jane Doe naked and comatose. And of course, they did to Jane Doe what they did to Tammy Lynn. The only thing is, in this case, Jane Doe lived. She woke up. But she had no idea the next day, she had no idea what happened to her.
1 week later, on June 15, 1991, Paul finds another young girl on his own. But Leslie Mahaffey will not be as lucky as Jane Doe. When we come back,
I said goodbye to her on Lakeshore Road and reminded her of her curfew, and she said, yeah, I'll call you. And she never did. They believed that she had probably run away again. And I believed that she'd met with foul play.
Why?
in December of 1990, Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, engaged to be married, rape and kill Carla's sister, 15-year-old Tammy. The police suspect no foul play, and they literally get away with murder. 6 months later, late one night in the town of Burlington, Ontario, Paul meets Leslie Mahaffey in front of her home, unable to get in.
So they started talking. And when he realized what the situation was, she wanted a cigarette. She walked back to his car. Once she was in the car, he decided to take her.
14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey had been out with friends that fateful night.
I said goodbye to her on Lakeshore Road and reminded her of her curfew, and she said, yeah, I'll call you. And she never did.
Leslie Mahaffey is a troubled teenager. She had some problems at home and had even run away 2 months before. So when Debbie Mahaffey realizes her daughter didn't come home that night, she panics.
I found her key on her dresser and realized, well, we had locked her out.
The local police department sends officers to the Mahaffey home, but Leslie's mother doesn't believe her case is given the attention it deserves.
They believed that she had probably run away again. And I believed that she'd met with foul play, and I couldn't convince them, and they couldn't convince me. I had such a gut feeling that something was terribly wrong.
Something was terribly wrong. As soon as Paul lures Leslie to his car in the early hours of the morning, her nightmare begins.
And then he took her home. So as far as we know, he raped her a couple of times that night. And then when Carla woke up, she became involved and participated. I don't think I need to be explicit about the sex acts, but you can imagine all possible sex acts. And they videotaped it.
Neither Karla Homolka nor her attorney agreed to be interviewed for this broadcast.
Anybody who has any information and any sense of this situation would say Karla could have easily saved this girl's life.
Though she would later claim to be as much of a victim of Paul Bernardo's wrath as the girls they assaulted and killed, there are those who would argue that she and Paul were equal partners in crime.
She was either content to let Paul go about doing what he wanted to do, or she wanted to get in on what was going on and could care less about the implications of what might happen to Leslie Mahaffey at the end of the day.
Either way, Leslie Mahaffey was about to die.
Karla gave her some sleeping pills, and then one or the other of them murdered her. And then they took her to the basement and dismembered her body.
In this tape obtained by MSNBC of a psychiatric evaluation conducted 3 years after the murder of Leslie Mahaffey, Karla not only puts the blame squarely on Paul, but also details his urge to turn his sadistic fantasies into reality.
First of all, he killed Leslie because she could identify him. Okay, the reason why he started bringing him home was because he wasn't satisfied with just like raping and leaving. He wanted to have it over and over and over again. That's why his ultimate fantasy was to have like sex lives to keep.
After the murder of Leslie Mahaffey, Karla and Paul encased Leslie's body parts in cement blocks and then dumped the blocks in a local lake. 12 days later, Paul and Karla are married in a lavish, expensive wedding at Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario.
As much of a fantasy wedding as you could possibly imagine. You couldn't do much more. She had a spectacular looking dress. It's great. Only problem was there's this dead body it's being uncovered in a lake at that very moment.
That same day, 2 people noticed some unusual blocks floating in Lake Gibson, about 15 miles from the wedding ceremony. Police are notified, as is the Mahaffey family.
I think the total destruction of her body was devastating to deal with, to even imagine. Our bodies are the temples of our soul, and to be able to kiss Leslie, to love Leslie, to touch her soul, we loved her body and soul. And that indignity and that horror that was committed on her, it was very, very hard to deal with.
As police start their homicide investigation, Paul and Karla are off on their Hawaiian honeymoon.
There's this absolutely, the only word that could describe it is grotesque soliloquy of Karla talking about what a wonderful guy she's living with and married to.
I just want to tell you that the beauty of this ocean, of this beach, of everything here, doesn't even come close to equaling the love that I feel for you.
Given what's just happened within the previous 2 weeks, is just mind-boggling.
Look at the husband.
But years later, according to Karla, this was just a performance, and the honeymoon was an occasion of physical abuse.
Constant beatings was hell. He wanted to abduct somebody, but there was nobody.
And when you came back, did you have lots of photographs to show people?
Mm-hmm. Photographs and video.
And were these staged in the sense that he told you you don't look happier because you've been having a great time, or?
He didn't tell me that, but I knew to smile for a photograph or video camera.
Over the next year, the police investigation into the murder of Leslie Mahaffey goes nowhere.
It It's mind-boggling to me that they haven't caught the person yet. Time just stood still.
Paul and Carla come home and go on to lead their, by all outward appearances, normal lives as young, attractive newlyweds. But Carla would later claim that she was forced into playing a part or else.
Like, I was so good at hiding abuse. Like, I mean, every time we went to my parents, I was totally unhappy because, I mean, on the way there, Paul would be lecturing me. You know, if you say or do anything to make them think that we're not happy, you know, if I'm going to kill you, you're going to get it.
When we come back,
we found on a church parking lot on Linwell Road, not too far from Kristen's home, we found one of her shoes and also a lock of what we later determined was her hair.
This
Due to mature and graphic subject matter, viewer discretion is advised. At the center of any criminal investigation is a dark heart and the iron hand of justice.
Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka not only do the unthinkable, but they videotape it, drugging young girls and sexually torturing them. They've already killed twice, and now another young girl is about to become victim to their twisted plan. But like most criminals, they make mistakes along the way that come back to haunt them. 15-year-old Kristen French is a popular and outgoing student at Holy Cross Secondary School in St. Catharines, Ontario.
Kristen was expected home from school at approximately 4 o'clock on that Thursday and didn't show up, and it was highly unusual to the point where her parents immediately notified police.
Inspector Gary Bolio is an officer with the Niagara Regional Police Department and participated in the unit formed to search for Kristen French.
We found on a church parking lot on Linwell Road, not too far from Kristen's home, we found one of her shoes and also a lock of what we later determined was her hair.
What officers didn't yet know was that Kristen French had been kidnapped by Carla and Paul Bernardo, who had driven to St. Catharines in search of their next victim. In one of her interviews with a psychiatrist, Carla describes what she says happened next.
We saw her and pulled into the parking lot, and he told me what to do. I didn't know what I was supposed to do was call her and ask her for directions and get out a map and get out of the car and leave the door open, and he was going to come around and put her in the car. So that's exactly what happened.
How was he supposed to keep her in the car?
He had a knife.
I see, so it was by threat. Okay, and it worked.
Yeah.
There were witnesses to the Kristen French abduction, and of course, at the time, the witnesses didn't understand the significance of what they had seen until Kristen's disappearance was reported in the media the following day.
Kristen, if you can hear or read this, we want to know that we are thinking of you.
Kristen French becomes yet another sex slave for Paul and Carla Bernardo.
It was just horrific. Just horrific. The thought of this, that she would be bound and gagged. The assaults were recorded on camera, and she was brutally beaten. Brutally beaten. Paul was threatening her with a knife at one stage, beating her on the small of the back, and you know, and she's allowed to bathe, and it was just totally demeaning. Totally demeaning. It couldn't have been worse.
And bizarre as it sounds, Carla actually claims she became friendly with Kristen.
What did you talk about?
We talked about like the boyfriend and the dog and just all kinds of girl stuff.
And by Easter Sunday, April 19th, 3 long days after she was kidnapped, Kristen French is killed.
Sunday came and he decided that it was time to kill her because it was my parents' house. He tied her legs together and handcuffed her hands and tied her to her chest. She was on her knees. And he put a rope around her neck. And he said to her, he raped her. And no, he didn't rape her, but he said something like, do you want to die? And just in the middle of her talking, he strangled her. He just cut her right off in the middle of her word.
But there are those who still believe Carla, not Paul, killed Kristen French.
Kristen French had enough blood in her lungs to drown. She was left alone, and Carla admitted to having a mallet with her to guard her. I have no problem thinking that Carla beat her to death with the mallet. And he came home to find her dead.
2 weeks after Kristen's disappearance, authorities searching for her, along with the entire St. Catherine's community, are shell-shocked.
Kristen French's body was found on a side road in the city of Burlington.
On May 12, 1992, 2 weeks later, investigators actually interview Paul Bernardo, but let him go.
It was based on a complaint or a tip from the public, from a member of the general public, an identified member, who said that he knew Bernardo and that Bernardo was considered a suspect or someone who was interviewed in the Scarborough rape investigation.
On his mantle, he had all these nice pictures of the local girl he had married and the wedding. And they just simply couldn't fathom that what was she doing while he was raping and pillaging? So when they went back to the station after interviewing him, he was promptly cleared and struck off the list.
Meanwhile, Toronto police are still trying to solve their Scarborough rape cases. Although the rapes had stopped 2 years before, the DNA that Paul so willingly provided police when he was a suspect has yet to be analyzed. But now, Paul Bernardo's world is beginning to fall apart.
I think Paul was disintegrating emotionally and mentally at that stage. If you look at the photographs of what he looked like, say about the time of the wedding, and then you look at him, a year and a half, 2 years later, it's just a weird-looking guy.
And Carla says that he took his frustrations out on her.
He had beaten me really badly, and my whole face was black and blue. The police have photographs of it.
On January 6, 1993, Carla Homolka checks herself into St. Catherine's General Hospital, files an assault charge against Paul, and leaves him.
She had decided that she no longer wanted to be any part of Paul's life and had gone off to live with her aunt and uncle.
Less than a month later, the DNA evidence that Paul gave up 3 years before comes back to haunt him.
They finally got the results of DNA that matched 3 of the rapes to him. So instead of arresting him, because they had another, 15 or 16 examples of other rape victims, they wanted to compare those. So they decided rather than arrest him, they put him under surveillance while they wrote a search warrant.
Police are now watching Paul Bernardo's every move.
They established 24-hour surveillance on Bernardo to make sure that we controlled any activity and make sure that we didn't have any further criminal offenses or victims.
And then they realized that he was married and that his wife had left him. So the Toronto police decided to go and interview her.
But Carla doesn't talk to the police right away.
She put them off. And while she put them off, the deputy chief of the Toronto police called the Niagara regional guy and said, you should have a look at this guy for your murders.
Before the interview, the Niagara police asked the Toronto investigators to question Carla about the Mickey Mouse watch she was wearing when she was photographed at the hospital.
So the Metro cops went to her uncle's place where she was holed up, and they started to interview her for 2 hours. And about 2 hours into the interview, they asked her about the watch. That told Carla, in her mind, that they were associating the rapes and the murders.
How would Carla know that? The Mickey Mouse watch was similar to the one that Kristen French, Carla and Paul's third victim, was wearing when she disappeared. When we come back.
I recall him being accused of these rather heinous crimes, the most heinous crimes I've ever been involved in, and he was showing general disinterest.
Over the past 3 years, Carla and Paul Bernardo have led a secret life, raping teenage girls, 3 of whom they killed: Carla's sister, Tammy, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French. But now, after being assaulted by Paul, Carla has left him and their marriage, giving police an opportunity to crack this case.
Metro Toronto Police Service Sexual Assault Squad members found Carla through her family and interviewed her.
The moment they left, she called George Walker's house, the lawyer, and made an appointment to go and see him. And she was so bold and so sure of herself that she actually got the cops who had interviewed her to drive her down to the lawyer's house in Niagara Falls.
She tells him this absolutely incredible story. You can't believe what I've been involved in.
Her attorney meets with an Ontario prosecutor to discuss the videotapes that Carla says she and Paul made of their crimes. They also talk about a plea bargain for Carla in exchange for her testimony against Paul.
As a result of Carla's information, all of a sudden they had some evidence of a link.
On February 17, 1993, Paul Bernardo is arrested at his home on the Scarborough rape charges. But police still don't have enough evidence to arrest him for the homicides.
This gentleman is Paul Bernardo. He's under arrest for various accounts of sexual assault.
The night of his arrest, Paul seems unfazed by what is going on around him, as shown in this police videotape obtained by MSNBC.
So what's going to happen from here, Paul? How do you feel about coming, sir?
No comment? No comment? No. Always a reason for your denial.
The next month, Carla is admitted to Northwestern Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. Her attorney also has another psychiatrist evaluate Carla, who later says, at the time of the assault on her sister Tammy, Carla showed signs of a battered wife in the making, a diagnosis that doesn't sit well with some, including Dr. Fred Berlin, an associate professor with the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Johns Hopkins University of Medicine. Although Berlin has not professionally evaluated Carla, he has studied her case file.
It's not that Carla reached the point where she couldn't stand it anymore and killed Paul, something that people would probably have had a little bit more sympathy for, knowing what we know now. She stood by or even actively participated in the killing of innocent victims. That's not what battered spouse syndrome is typically all about.
On February 19, 1993, police begin a 71-day search of the home on 57 Bayview, looking for any and all evidence, including the infamous videotapes which Carla had already discussed with police. But they are unable to find them. After the police's search warrant expires, they inform Paul Bernardo's attorney, Ken Murray, that their hunt has been unsuccessful. But then, anxious to keep the tapes from prying eyes, Paul Bernardo handwrites his attorney a letter and draws a map that will lead him to the videotapes, which are hidden in the upstairs bathroom ceiling. The letter reads, "If you cannot reach them, pull down the ceiling in that area. They are most definitely there. Note, very important."
Sure enough, with some little rethinking of just which way the map was configured, they found the right pot light, stuck their hand in there, and bingo, out dropped these 6 videotapes. And they kept them.
The defense team has no legal obligation to inform the prosecution of their find. So, the prosecution, still lacking evidence in the homicide charges against Paul, needs Carla as a witness more than ever.
Here's her lawyer saying, look, without her, you don't have a case. You can't convict Paul Bernardo of anything.
we didn't have enough evidence to prosecute Paul Bernardo. And if that's what it took to prosecute Paul Bernardo, then it had to be done.
On May 14, 1993, a plea bargain for Carla Leanne Homolka is finalized.
She would be charged with the offense of manslaughter of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey. And she would be given a sentence of 12 years.
4 days later, Paul is charged with the double homicides of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. On July 6, 1993, Carla is sentenced to a 12-year prison term. Meanwhile, Paul's attorney, Ken Murray, still retains those all-important videotapes, just as his client advised him to. But more than a year later, he resigns from the case. He then turns over the tapes to Paul Bernardo's new attorney, who then gives the videos to police. Eventually, Ken Murray is charged with obstructing justice. Murray argued that he believed he didn't have to turn the tapes over and intended to use them at the trial to incriminate Carla. Later, Murray is cleared of all charges. John Rosen and his partner Tony Bryant take over Paul Bernardo's case. And according to Tony Bryant, the discovery of the tapes caused a firestorm of outrage.
Well, of course, once the tapes became public and everybody could see what happened to Carla and then realized that she'd gotten the deal of the century, it was a tremendous outcry of this isn't right.
The point is that these videotapes make the case against both of them a no-brainer. I mean, you could essentially take 30 stills from the videos, throw them in front of a jury, and have a conviction in two hours.
But prosecutors have already made a deal with Carla.
After I saw them, of course, I wished that things could have been different, but unfortunately, there wasn't much at that point that we could do about it.
People who have seen the tapes say they not only show Carla actively participating in the rape of her sister Tammy, but also show her sexually abusing Jane Doe, a critical incident that she never told police. And with this, her deal comes under heavy fire, as it required her to be forthright, truthful, and complete.
They could have rescinded the deal. They had every good reason to do it. They even had legal justification to do it, and they decided not to.
According to a source close to the case, some believe the prosecution from day one was attempting to paint Carla as a victim rather than a perpetrator.
He used to make me kneel on the floor in the middle of the bedroom and made me stare straight ahead, and he would walk around me in circles and kick me. And I wasn't allowed to look, so I wouldn't know when it was coming.
And there are those who would argue that this sort of image, Carla under Paul's control, was self-serving on the part of the prosecution.
It was an excuse contrived by the government to explain, try and explain, create a subterfuge about their relationship with her.
But Carla's deal remains in effect.
Let's make no mistake about it, the prime mover in this case was Paul Bernardo. And if that's what it took to prosecute Paul Bernardo, then it had to be done.
When we come back,
she may indeed have been battered and mistreated, and that may have had a significant impact on her. And there were times where she could have helped these victims out of his presence, where indeed she didn't.
Well, he raped her when I was there, and I think he made me leave twice.
Why did he make you leave?
I don't know.
prosecutors have made a deal with Carla Homolka for the homicides of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, and is now preparing to try Paul Bernardo on his own. But some believe that the lethal dynamics of Paul and Carla as a couple cannot and should not be overlooked. Dr. Fred Berlin is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University. Although he has never professionally evaluated Carla Homolka, he has studied her case.
All we know is that he did not kill anybody prior to his involvement with Carla, and that at least 3 different women, including Carla's sister, were dead after that involvement.
I think one of the reasons that he wanted me to kill the next girl was to make me more involved.
She may indeed have been battered and mistreated, and that may have had a significant impact on her. And there were times where she could have helped these victims out of his presence, where indeed she didn't.
Well, he raped her when I was there, and I think he made me leave twice.
Why didn't he intervene?
I don't know. And now that I look back, I think how stupid. I mean, I should have gone to the police from day one. But my mind was so messed up.
There's two possibilities. One, that he simply was escalating and would have killed anyway. The other possibility, though, is that her influence somehow impacted upon him in a way that made him or the couple more dangerous, and that the deaths of these women had as much to do with her as it did with him.
At Paul's trial, he submits a not guilty plea on all charges. The horrific videotapes of Paul and Carla assaulting Tammy Homolka, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French are played for the jury. The rest of the courtroom is only able to listen.
When the first tape was being shown, we were sitting in very comfortable chairs, but the chairs sit inside like church pews, so there's a wooden wall behind the chairs, and I found myself pushing my chair back into the wall, and I think I may have broken that wall.
Leslie Mahaffey's mother, Debbie, is in the courtroom.
It felt like abandoning her not to be in the courtroom with her, that surely the pain that I would feel by hearing her would be nothing compared to the pain that she would have endured. I have never heard her scream other than delight, but I've never heard her cry in pain. 3 minutes, 3 seconds, I don't know. I knew it was her.
My heart just bled every day for the Mahaffeys and the French families. And so you could hear them gasping and crying and sobbing, and you just wanted to go and console them because you felt so badly for them.
On August 31st, the jury is sequestered for verdict deliberations. The next day, Paul Bernardo's verdict is read. Guilty on all counts. Paul Kenneth Bernardo is sentenced to 25 years in prison, the maximum allowed by Canadian law. In order to avoid another high-profile trial for the Scarborough rapes, the judge declares him a dangerous offender, extending his jail term indefinitely.
I think everyone was pleased to see justice done. It was a general feeling that justice was done in terms of the case against Paul Bernardo. I think a lot of people were and are, for good reason, still disappointed about the circumstances with Carla Homolka.
Carla Homolka spent 12 years behind bars and was released in July 2005.
I can't imagine that she could walk out of prison and find anywhere to live in Canada where she doesn't look over her shoulder or wonder. And I think that's a good thing.
There's never been a crime or more evidence of a crime and more explicit evidence of a crime that would say, you know, your instincts are to put these people out of their misery and vanquish them from the earth. Now, of course, I don't advocate that. Personally, I'm against the death penalty. But is she coming out of prison? What an abhorrent aberration of justice.
After Bernardo's murder conviction, the judge sealed the infamous sex tapes. In January 2005, author Stephen Williams pleaded guilty to mistakenly violating a gag order. Prosecutors say he published some of Bernardo's victims' names on a website, material that must have come from the banned tapes. Williams was given 3 years probation and 75 hours community service. As for Carla Homolka, she was released in July 2005. Because she pleaded guilty to manslaughter and not a sex crime, she will not be required to disclose her new address on Canada's National Sex Offender Registry. That's our report. I'm John Siegenberg.
For information on upcoming programs, go to prime.msnbc.com.